The United States of America, the country that pioneered the belief that one's rights are given to them at birth by God. The Constitution of the United States was carefully engineered to protect these rights from government overreach. Having had previous experiences with tyranny, the Founding Fathers knew exactly which rights would be most under attack in the event of a totalitarian regime. They placed these rights into the First Amendment of the Constitution to signify their importance. These rights include freedom of speech.
We just did Ann Coulter's speech. They tried to ban her, and we can't allow that.
Freedom to assemble. Freedom of religion. Freedom to petition the governments. And freedom of the press.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay!
For some reason, during every election cycle and presidency, regardless of who wins,
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton.
Rhetoric will be exchanged by the losing party, who for some reason always feels that this rhetoric is both accurate and appropriate, that almost always follows the same template.
Control of every aspect of this nation by the federal government. And if you want dictatorship, then that's the way to get it.
That's exactly what Obama is. He rules as a dictator.
Dictator, hiding between his ears. That's what he is.
I found a list of some of the defining features of fascism, but I've come up with a handy mnemonic device. You just listen to things said by Donald Trump.
We don't have the luxury to take a back seat as this man is arrogant, marching us towards fascism.
We elected a fascist yesterday, a 21st century fascist.
Are those statements accurate? What exactly is it like to live under a totalitarian regime? Throughout history, we have seen the brutality that results from complete power being given to the state, but how do these events affect the individual? To answer this question, I read Gulag, A History by Anne Applebaum, which details the history of Soviet concentration camps that held over 30 million prisoners. I will now explain to you the difference between living under an actual tyrant and living under a president whom you don't like. Gulag camps existed throughout the Soviet Union, but the largest camps lay in the most extreme geographical and climatic regions of the country, from the Arctic North to the Siberian East and the Central Asian South. Prisoners were engaged in a variety of economic activities, but their work was typically unskilled, manual, and economically inefficient. The combination of endemic violence, extreme climate, hard labor, meager food rations, and unsanitary conditions led to extremely high death rates in the camps. While the Gulag was radically reduced in size following Stalin's death in 1953, forced labor camps and political prisoners continued to exist in the Soviet Union right up to the Gorbachev era. The Gulag held many political prisoners, a group including not only real opponents of the Soviet regime, but also many innocents caught up in the paranoid clutches of the Soviet secret police. Most prisoners were the victims of arbitrary and severe legal campaigns under which petty theft, lateness, or unexcused absences from work were punished by many years in these concentration camps.
Only Donald Trump could use a conversation about missile strikes in the Middle East to advertise the cake at Mar-a-Lago.
In a totalitarian regime, this would never have aired. The state would control all media and would only air propaganda in support of the leader. For the sake of argument, let's explore what would happen if this joke were to air under a real dictatorship. As overkill as it seems, unfortunately, it is the reality. John Oliver would no longer exist. He would be shot so that an example would be made to all others who might be considering speaking out against the leader. Thankfully, everyone in the audience who laughed at the joke would not receive as harsh of a punishment. For those in the audience who laughed at the joke, they would face a minimum of 25 years in the Gulag. It is likely their sentence would be even longer since the joke was made about the leader himself, but even a joke made about an associate of the leader could land you with a sentence of that magnitude. During their non-working hours, prisoners typically lived in a camp zone surrounded by a fence or barbed wire, overlooked by armed guards and watchtowers. The zone contained a number of overcrowded, stinking, poorly heated barracks. Life in a camp zone was brutal and violent. Prisoners competed for access to all of life's necessities, and violence among the prisoners was commonplace. If they survived hunger, disease, the harsh elements, heavy labor, and their fellow prisoners, they might succumb to arbitrary violence at the hands of camp guards. All the while, prisoners were watched by informers, fellow prisoners always looking for some misstep to report to Gulag authorities. The Gulag mortality rate was roughly 20%. Relatively speaking, it does not seem tremendously dangerous. However, that number assumes that you would even make it to the Gulag without being shot first or starving to death on the way there. Also, your experience in the Gulag would make you more vulnerable to illnesses and other conditions once you were free from it, if you ever were. You may be asking yourself why I spoke so much about the Russian gulags in a presentation that was supposed to be centered around totalitarian governments in general. The answer is quite simple. Concentration camps represent everything that happens when the state has complete control over a population. Something as simple as a suspected thought crime would get you sent to one without chance for explanation, and they are not just unique to Soviet-era Russia. Every dictator that I showed you towards the beginning of the presentation had their own form of concentration camp, where political prisoners would be sent to for speaking out against them. While most of the footage is grainy and old, you may have noticed that the footage of Kim Jong-un was shot in 1080p. This is because he is still actively running a totalitarian government and restricting his citizens of their God-given right to free speech. It should be obvious that we have nothing similar to these forms of governments in the United States. However, in other parts of the world, they are still a very real problem. Would you like to know what would happen if someone spoke out against the President of the United States? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No public execution, no daily bread ration, no gulag, no 25 years hard labor, nothing. But for some reason, people throw the term dictator around as if it has no meaning whenever they're unsatisfied with the executive branch. In case you still don't understand, here are some signs that you are not living under a dictatorship. If your leader cannot pass legislation because he's being blocked by his political opponents, you don't live under a dictatorship. If 80% of all media about your leader is negative, you don't live under a dictatorship. If people can freely spread disgusting rumors about your leader through the press, you don't live under a dictatorship. If someone can publish a photo of themselves holding your leader's decapitated head and not be missing within 72 hours, you don't live under a dictatorship.